Let's start with Blood Done Sign My Name because you lived it as a child. There's an innocence there that we all begin with as children before we really know about the world. There's a story that you tell about when those first two African American boys came to your school and there was a water fountain.
Yes, that was at the elementary school in Oxford. North Carolina, like a lot of places, integrated, just stuck their toe in the water. Two black boys, I think they were doctor's sons, came to our school. It was a way of complying with integration, with the court order, without complying. But I just remembered being behind one of them at the water fountain on the playground, which was an old iron water fountain. And you would step on the pedal, and then it would take a minute to come, and then up would gurgle this kind of iron smelling water. And then when he moved away and it was my turn to drink, I felt hesitant to drink after him. And that was a mystery to me. Someone had kenneled this vicious lie in my brain from whence I do not know, that black was filthy, that black was bad, that somehow I had a certain revulsion. And then I just threw that off, uh, if not forever, for the moment, uh, and drank after him. But I let the water run just a little bit.
And you said that makes you a moderate
That made me a moderate, yes.
in the book.
I drank after him, but I let the water run a little bit.
And what I love about the book, it weaves in seamlessly your childlike understanding of the events, the murder, the mayhem, the court case, your father, mixed up in the middle, trying to hold everything together, hold the peace. You weave that together with what you learned after you got your PhD, after you returned to the town and to all of the original sources, including the murderers, to get the full story. I think that's why the book speaks to so many people because we are that child
Yes.
when we first hear about these cases, completely not understanding the history and the context. But let's just, for those who haven't read the book, let's talk about the murder that's at the center of Blood Done Sign My Name.
Henry Merrill was 23. He was just home from the Army. Robert Teal owned a Crossroads country store in the black community. Henry Merrill walked in, had a misunderstanding with Robert Teal's daughter-in-law. They thought he had made a flirtatious remark or said something profane. Robert Teal had two older sons, 18 and 21, who were there, and they chased him out of the store, and he took off running. And Mr. Teal shot him in the buttocks with a shotgun and knocked him skidding down onto his face in the gravel. They went over and beat him with the stocks of the shotguns. They broke one of the shotgun stocks on his head. And then one of them put the barrel of a rifle right down against his forehead and shot him, you know, like you would kill a snake. And this was not a murder mystery. This happened in front of a number of people. But they were tried, and there was an all-white jury that acquitted the Teals, even though they had done this in a public place. The town of Oxford was about 10,000 people. It's a tobacco market town. These big wooden warehouses downtown where the tobacco was stored and sold. And some of the black veterans in town who were home from Vietnam got together at McCoy's pool hall and made fire bombs. And they burned down a couple of the warehouses. These things are as big as a college basketball gym, full of tobacco, a known flammable substance, and they're made of pine. And you could see the fire for 20 miles, and we were 4 blocks away.
The family that was responsible for the murder, they were neighbors of yours, and the boy that was your age was your best friend.
He wasn't my best friend,
Okay.
but I knew him well. And he had told me that his father and his brothers had killed this young black man. And in my 11-year-old way, I thought I knew enough to know that you murder somebody, North Carolina had the death penalty. So I knew that if you murdered somebody, you ended up in the gas chamber. I thought that, that the court was like that, that the courts found out the truth and followed the law. And so I was quite shocked when they were acquitted, um, dumbfounded.
One of the questions I had during the Trayvon Martin saga was why on earth people all over the United States were sending money to Trayvon's killer.
Right,
And when I read your book and you talked about how the white gentry of Oxford, the old money, how they loathed Robert Teal. He was just a criminal. He was always getting arrested. He'd assaulted a police officer twice and gotten away with that. He just a couple of weeks before that assaulted a different black man. For whatever reason, he was never locked up. But they just looked down on him like nothing else. But once he had killed Henry Merrill, they took a different attitude toward him. And I think that was the epiphany for me. They used their levers of power and they used their money to make sure there wasn't a conviction.
right.
And why were they interested in that?
To uh, circle the wagons in defense of the system. Part of that was always, you know, what was intended to be a white monopoly on violence. People were upset about school integration, which was going to happen that fall, full-blown school integration. And the idea underneath it really, segregation was always about sex on this simmering internal uh, sort of lizard brain level. Uh, the idea of interracial sex was so abhorrent to most white people. And the idea that white girls and black boys would be in the same school, that led them to believe that this was going to lead to some kind of mongrelization of the races, and this was going to be the worst thing that ever happened. And that's connected thematically to the murder because of the alleged flirtatious remark, which justified killing in the minds of some few, I think. The people in power kept themselves in power by representing white citizenry. And the white citizenry was objecting to, uh, didn't want the Teals to be convicted. And, neither did the gentry.
Well, the same thing happened in the Emmett Till case. That horrible sheriff who did everything he could to make sure that there would be no conviction.
We never have any trouble until some of our southern niggers go up north and the NAACP talks to them and they come back home.
This is to me the most important part of the architecture of a lynching. Now, the old lynchings, the postcard lynchings, those were classes in white supremacy. And Bob Zellner, a white man who grew up not far from a lynching that took place in Dothan, Alabama, just before he was born, said the lynchings taught children and others about white supremacy, not just blacks, but also whites. He would talk about how they would bring children to the corpse after it had been hung and broken and burned, and they would have children prod and poke at it with a fork to try to teach them that this is not a human being, right? And then there came this time, those kind of postcard lynchings weren't happening anymore, but there was this hunger for this entire process, the violence, the spectacle, the stories, and then the justice system failing. And so when I ask myself, well, why? Why are we so addicted to police violence? And why are people sending money to the defense funds when police kill an unarmed black boy or man? Why did Donald Trump start his, entry into politics with the Central Park Five case?
Absolutely.
There's a hunger that cannot be satisfied for these stories that establish racial hierarchies.
Yeah. Yeah. Lynching is a special kind of murder. It's not just somebody losing their temper and flying off the handle. Lynching is supposed to represent the values of the community. The people who commit the lynching are acting in the name of the community as they perceive it, in defense of values, traditional values, white supremacy, chief among them. It is not something you could change. And so the people in Oxford in 1970, when Henry Merrill was murdered, they rallied around the murderers in the name of white supremacy. So that's why I called it a late model lynching. It had the characteristics of a lynching. It was just a slight bit different. The old, you know, what you were calling a postcard lynching, where people would take pictures of the lynching and print postcards and sell them, and they would be passed around. These holy relics of this ritual violence. Those things could take place on the courthouse lawn. They were announced in advance so that people could come, and there'd be crowds in the hundreds, sometimes thousands. And yet children were, you see pictures of those lynchings, and you can find the children in the crowd.
Sometimes not very far from the body or from the picnic lunch that their parents brought.
Yeah, it was like that. But there was a large organization of white women in the South that opposed lynching openly. In the old days, the South was the stronghold of the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party was the party of white supremacy. But after several million black people, black Southerners, moved north, and they're moving from where they can't vote to a place they can vote, places like Chicago and Cleveland and Gary and Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and New York City. Those are in states that have a lot of electoral votes. And the new black vote was larger than the margin of defeat or victory last time. So black votes could carry a national election. So then the Democratic Party increasingly became a national party and was the party of urban political machines, was the party of organized labor and black voters in the North. So the powers that be leaned on Southern political leaders hard to knock it off. So then, Emmett Till, his murder was meant to be an announcement about white supremacy, but it was meant to be secret as well. They put his body in the river. They tried to hide it. It wasn't a courthouse lawn kind of lynching because there was pressure not to do that. They weren't going to get convicted in Mississippi, but it wasn't like the masses of white Mississippians thought that lynching Emmett Till was a great thing. The newspapers in 1955, after Emmett Till was lynched in Mississippi, all came out against it. But then when you got when the whole world was looking down on white Mississippi about it, people reverted to tribe, as it were. And the men who killed Emmett Till, when they were acquitted, that was celebrated.
There were little jars for people to drop money in stores, in the drugstore, and the dry cleaners, and commercial places in the town of Sumner for the defense of the two men accused of the murder. And I must say it was a strange, eerie feeling to see these little jars of money being collected to defend two men who, it seemed, understood were the murderers.
So you write the prequel, The Blood of Emmett Till, and the context in 1955 was the Brown v. Board decision, right? That began the process of integration, and the people in Mississippi who were advocating for the right to vote. And then there was the Citizens Council. The narrative that they wove was, just like you said a little while ago, that was about interracial sex. And I wonder which one you think was the one that doomed Emmett Till.
Well, it's a combination of things. The Brown decision had sent much of the white South whirling into a kind of insanity. There was a reporter interviewed a guy about the Emmett Till case and the feelings that people had, and he said, I'm not going to live in a place where black people are in the government, because if they're in the government, then they can control the laws that I live under, and I won't have that. I'm not going to live in a place with integrated schools, because what if my daughter came home dating a black boy? So he was explaining the connection between the political and the personal in that way. The whole, what W.B. Cash called the Southern rape complex, all of that was a rhetorical tool, among other things, to manipulate white people to do things that they might not otherwise do in the name of racial purity. I remember there were some guys painting our house once, and one of them asked me, "What would you do if your sister married a black man?" And I said, "Well, what kind of man is he?" Does he love my sister? Is he going to be a good family member? Will he take good care of her? Does she love him? He wasn't all that happy with my answer. But the other painter, who was also white, said, now that is the words of wisdom,
Hmm.
and tried to convince the other painter that the 14-year-old was correct on this point. So you can see underneath the conversation about integration, there always simmered this molten kind of thing about interracial sex.
All right, dramatic new information has emerged in the story of one of the nation's most notorious crimes, the murder of black teenager Emmett Till. In 1955, a 21-year-old white woman named Carolyn Bryant claimed that Till made sexual advances toward her.
She lied. And a book author unveiled this and found out 10 years ago, so we're trying to figure out why in the world.
You didn't reveal this interview for 7 years later?
Yeah. Well, it took 8 years really to write the book. It took about 7 years to do the research because this is a global story. So
Why
there was
didn't
a
you tell
lot
us at
of
the
evidence.
time that you had this interview?
You know, I'm a historian.
Yeah.
You know, we don't think in terms of, you know, the media and the moment.
The book comes out, and Carolyn Bryant is still alive then. And there's tremendous amount of focus on the fact that she admits to lying about some sort of sexual assault or something.
Yes.
But you say in a lot of interviews, oh, we don't need to focus on that. Of course, she lied. In some ways, you defended her.
Well, I didn't defend her. What she did was despicable. In point of fact, though, people were not very well informed. All she confessed to doing was committing perjury. Statute of limitations on perjury is 2 years. So since 1957, she couldn't have been prosecuted for it.
Well, I liked what you said to one of the journalists. She's like, well, God, why didn't you run and do a headline story like a journalist would? And you're like, I'm a historian. But she lied. And you said, well, I assumed she lied.
Her mother didn't think she was telling the truth, I'm sure. That was the lie that was told. They'd heard that lie 100 times before. Soon after I interviewed her, I got a document, which was an interview that she did with her attorney about 2 days after her husband and brother-in-law were arrested for murder, to try to figure out what actually happened so they can prepare a defense. And she says nothing about sex. She says nothing about a sexual remark. She says nothing about him touching her at all. And that was right after it happened. I assumed that was a fairly reliable story. That was her account that I believed was that one. The account that she gave at the trial was heavily coached. You can tell on the transcript, really. They were just telling a story that would justify the murder in the minds of white male jurors, which is all they had in Mississippi at the time. That protection of white womanhood that's so deep in the culture of the white South was what they were tapping on. Defense attorney said, you know, I know that every red-blooded white man among you is going to, you know, vote to acquit these men, as if it was their racial duty.
I was with you the night that Trayvon Martin's killer was acquitted.
I recall.
Yeah, and we have a lot of video.
But there's like 4 or 5 different kinds of manslaughter, and you saying it acquittal? What do you tell them, like, not to wear hoodies? What do I tell them, like, when you turn 13, 14 years old, don't wear hoodies outside at dark? Not to go to the store after a certain time? That's not liberation. That's not freedom.
I would say that I'm more hurt than anger, because I often think of like the family. I've said this before. I'm like, this was their final opportunity for closure.
And one of the things you talked about was the fact that the film Birth of a Nation, until Star Wars came out, was seen by more Americans than any film ever made.
That's right. And the heroes of Birth of a Nation are the Ku Klux Klan, who come riding over the hill like the cavalry in an old-timey Western and save the day. And what they do is save white womanhood from the assaults of these leering, animalistic black characters in the film. Yeah, that was America's first blockbuster film, and one that was the biggest blockbuster until Star Wars, right?
You had to go all the way to Star Wars to have more people see the movie. People saw it 10 times a piece. It was shown in the White House. And that narrative of the black beast rapist, right, that was created at the turn of the century. It's a political creation. It had a political... Nobody said that. The Confederates, when they went off to war, nobody said the black enslaved men are going to rape the women. Nobody said that's going to happen. They didn't accuse black...
them in your house making your food and making your...
Say that was a creation of the turn of the century when they needed to bring the hammer down and take black people's voting rights away and lynch people. It's a recipe for murder, just like the glorification of any race and the degradation of another is always going to be a recipe for murder. Murder. It doesn't matter where you are. When somebody starts going Hutu power, there's going to be death.
I'll just tell you a quick little story I heard in Belhaven, North Carolina. There was a new white sheriff who brought his wife from, some city center, and the wife wasn't happy there. So she made up a story that she'd been raped by a black man who came in through her bedroom window. And so they got the posse together, and they didn't know who did it because obviously no one did it. It was a lie. And so they grabbed the leader of the community, the African-American leader. And, wouldn't that send a message if they lynched him? And they paraded him through town with a noose around his neck on the back of a pickup truck until the woman stopped it all by admitting that she'd lied. There was always a lie at the core of it. I mean, did anybody ever... But was the inciting incident ever true?
Yes, I think so, but not often, and it didn't need to be true. Nearly all rape has always occurred inside a racial group. Most of the people who rape white women are white men. I've just started reading a book about a rape, murder, and lynching, in which it's pretty clear that the accused was guilty. But, there were rape panics in rural eastern North Carolina. Black soldiers had come back from the World War II and thought they should be able to vote, thought they should be citizens. They had put their lives on the line for democracy. And a black man who was sitting in an alley downtown near the movie theater, and the woman that worked at the movie theater, an 18-year-old sort of local beauty queen, goes walking down the alley, and she almost steps on the black man and screams. And he ran and she ran, but nobody raped anybody or even touched anybody. And a mob came and got him out of jail that night to lynch him. And he actually was able to jump out of the car while it was rolling and run and went into the swamp and was able to elude the lynch mob. He went to a black minister's house, and carloads of black men with guns ferried him out of the county and drove him to Alexandria, Virginia, to the FBI office, and he turned himself in to the FBI. The woman refused to say that he had raped her, so the grand jury wouldn't charge him. They wouldn't charge the lynch mob either, though, of attempted murder.
Mm-hmm.
In the fury about that thing, there was this rumor that there was a rape movement going on, that all over eastern North Carolina, black men, they've come home from the war, achieved this new stature, or making these claims on a new stature. And immediately that was connected to rape, though there were no incidents to affirm that, except this one thing that wasn't a rape.
Well, it works. I mean, that's why that's the story. The Wilmington riots of 1898 were incited by these parades of the women in the white petticoat saying, "Please protect me."
Furnifold Simmons, who would go on to be a United States Senator, Charles Aycock, who would go on to be governor of North Carolina, and Josephus Daniels, who was editor of the Raleigh News and Observer. The three of them got together in a hotel and hatched a campaign that would talk about white women being endangered by black men holding office.
The white press portrayed blacks as monsters, representing them as an incubus, a mythical figure that raped women while they slept.
white women appeared in parades, on floats, in white dresses, holding up signs saying, "Protect us."
Deliberately fueling racial fires, a white newspaper published an inflammatory speech given by a leading Georgia feminist, Rebecca Felton.
If it requires lynching to protect woman's dearest possession from ravening, drunken human beasts, then I say lynch 1,000 Negroes a week.
They invented a rape scare in 1898 for the purpose of justifying a violent overthrow, really, of the whole state's government, but particularly in Wilmington, which was the stronghold of the Fusion Coalition, which was an interracial political coalition, which was in power. The Wilmington Race Riot was overthrowing a democratically elected interracial government. They were using the hottest button that they could find to get white men who had voted with black men and the fusion movement to shame them. You don't love your mother, you don't love your daughter, you don't love your sister. You're letting, putting these black men in power to shame them, and also as a kind of a whip to stir people to commit mass murder. So that whole interracial rape myth has been, the most consistently used device in the history of the South. And, it's not strictly limited to the South. In my study of Chicago, the big thing in Chicago was residential segregation. Chicago far more segregated than anywhere in the South ever was. Mob violence was used to stop black families from moving into white neighborhoods. And the neighborhood associations that sought to keep white neighborhoods white used the same device that, there would be sex between white women and black men, and the neighborhood would not be safe from rape. Also, they would say, and black men will take your job.
Well, when I met you, in 2013, I think that you were right and Reverend Barber was right in describing that time as the third Reconstruction.
Yes.
And I wrote to you, and I wonder if you agree that the third Reconstruction has ended and this is now the third white supremacist counter-revolution.
Well, yes, I agree that there's a white backlash going on. I would say that Trumpism precedes Trump a lot, that really in the 50s and 60s, and 70s, there was a turnover of racial system in America and, the gains of the civil rights movement. And the backlash against them was immediate and sustained. And that has been part of conservative politics ever since. People forget, in this halo that Ronald Reagan seems to have inherited somehow, people forget how racialized his campaign was. And how the white South became Republican stronghold because of objections to the gains of the civil rights movement. So I think a historian will probably write the decades following World War II, social movements rose up that challenged the social order, particularly the civil rights movement about race, but also the women's movement, also the gay rights movement. And they engendered a very powerful backlash, which went on for 75 or 100 years. Who knows how long? But we are in it. This situation that we're in is special. Trump has his own particular brand of insanity, and he's become a powerful demagogue and has taken control of the Republican Party. But the things he's preaching are deeply rooted in American conservative backlash politics.
Right. Well, the Central Park 5 case was a case where 5 men of color were accused of raping a white woman. Turned out they were innocent.
5 youths were arrested at 96th Street, all between 14 and 15 years of age.
2 weeks after their high-profile arrest, Donald Trump took out full-page ads in 4 major newspapers calling for the death penalty to be reinstated. But none of them were guilty.
You better believe that I hate the people that took this girl and raped her brutally. You better believe it. And it's more than anger, it's hatred. And I want society to hate them.
Men cleared after spending years in prison for a crime they did not commit.
He inserted himself into that for the reason I mentioned earlier, right? In the absence of the postcard lynchings, there need to be new stories, new ways of expressing white supremacy. And by the way, in that same period, that's where professional wrestling became so important. This whole podcast began because I was outraged that they had brought rape into professional wrestling, something I had liked as a child, and I didn't know this until I saw this documentary. But in the wrestling stories, basically what they do is they create the conditions by which you can hate someone so much that they ought to be publicly destroyed.
Yeah.
And for a long time, certainly when I was watching it in the 80s, it was about race.
Yes.
The bad guy was from Asia, Africa, Polynesia, and Hulk Hogan would have to destroy him. People are hungry for that. Trump, he understood this. That's why he got involved in the Central Park Five case, and that's why birtherism really became his ticket to political stardom. Vince McMahon, he kept it within his little play world of wrestling, and Donald Trump, one of Vince McMahon's stars, goes from the tabloids to the newspapers to cable news and now to the White House.
Yes. There's another thing about Black political power in America. It has always been portrayed as illegitimate, inherently illegitimate. That's birtherism. But that's tapping on roots as deep as the Reconstruction era.
It's hard to believe that he doesn't just issue his birth certificate. It would be so easy to do if, in fact, he has one.
The idea that Black political power is inherently illegitimate and that Black people are outsiders to the good and decent social order. The evidence didn't matter much, just as in the Central Park Five case, they had identified another man as the rapist, had tested him, his DNA confirmed that he was the rapist, and the DNA of the Central Park Five confirmed that they were not. But that didn't matter to Trump because he was, as you point out, he's using it as a tool. And he said Mexicans were rapists who were coming in over the border to rape your women. Again, it's the other, the outsider, and using that rape trope as a way of manipulating people's fears.
I want to share, I actually texted to you already that as I was reading The Blood of Emmett Till and I had to go to a doctor's appointment, had to put it down for a few hours, I found I missed it. And then I said, well, why do I miss being in Jim Crow, Mississippi? What's drawing me back there besides your beautiful writing? And I think it was the courage and the example set by people who actually faced worse things than what we face today.
The story had always been told as a, racial horror movie, a Southern horror movie starring Redneck Frankenstein. And, just that was the point, is this is just horrible, horrible. Well, it is horrible, horrible, of course. But what struck me is how courageous Emmett Till's mother was in having an open casket. And also, she started calling newspapers as soon as she got the news that her son had been murdered. That was just not a normal thing for a Black woman to do in 1955. It sort of launched this media campaign. But she got on the phone and started calling all the reporters. When his body arrived back in Chicago, there was a huge group of people there, lots of them reporters. And this became a global media spectacle. And hundreds of thousands of people across America got involved in protesting the lynching and the acquittals. They raised enormous sums of money. Emmett Till's protests raised money to buy a fleet of station wagons to send to Montgomery, Alabama, to keep the bus boycott going. It greatly expanded the ranks of the NAACP. It greatly expanded support for civil rights. It, and in many ways, it sparked the modern civil rights movement.
I mean, the example is what you talk about with Emmett Till. And then with, I don't know if you told that story tonight.
T.R.M. Howard spoke at the Dexter Memorial Baptist Church in Montgomery. And this was about 4 days before Rosa Parks got arrested. She attended. She spoke of it later. She said on the bus, I thought about Emmett Till and I just couldn't move. A. Philip Randolph and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, centered in Chicago, did fundraisers in Chicago and Detroit and New York. And I found a tape of
of the fundraiser in New York, Randolph he's introducing Eleanor Roosevelt, T.R.M. Howard, Adam Clayton Powell. There are tens of thousands of people there, and he starts taking up a collection. He says that we can't bring back that child, but there's a bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama happening right now. We need to support that. They're getting $1,000. This is 1956. The first thing the Montgomery bus boycott did was buy a dozen brand new station wagons. They started a cab company, essentially. That was the black labor movement responding to Emmett Till case, and that's where they got the money to do it. The other thing is, how old was Emmett Till? He was 14, but how old was Julian Bond when Emmett Till was here? The whole sit-in movement was Emmett Till's age. When they got to college, they were 18, 19, 20 in there, right? And look at the sit-in movement. It was done by Emmett Till. Everybody says we saw that. I saw that picture in Jet. I was never the same. I thought that could have been me. John Lewis, all of the whole leadership, and actually, if you look at the interviews, it's just like dozens and dozens. Everybody mentions Emmett Till because that was the formative experience. That was the thing that was like the river of no return for them.
This is your generation's Emmett Till.
With the terrible predicaments that we face around race today, I think it's important to realize that people did go through a lot worse and asserted themselves and organized and created a movement that, insufficiently but very significantly changed American society. And this whole racial reckoning, after the murder of George Floyd, Black Lives Matter rose up. And a few months later, 64% of Americans told opinion pollsters that they supported Black Lives Matter. It didn't stay that high, but that was such an illustration of the brutal injustice of our police and legal system.
I was in Australia. I didn't have my finger on the pulse on how they essentially reversed Black Lives Matter. They reversed it to the point where jackhammers just obliterated those words from the street.
Under pressure from Republicans, work has begun to remove the large yellow Black Lives Matter plaza in D.C.
This is where the word matter was, the next block, lives, and the next block, black. So these crews are out here actually tearing up the bollards to begin.
The fact that George Floyd was murdered on video, there was a lot of power in the natural human response of human empathy that the world had. But that was reversed, wasn't it? I mean, not just in terms of poll numbers, but in terms of who harnessed the political power from that moment. In the end, it wasn't we who believe in justice.
Well, Black Lives Matter made its mark and is still with us, and you can chip it up off the street if you want to. But that's not going to stop the movement. The movement will take new shapes. It is taking new shape now. And these, they've got all these interwoven issues driven by race, but it's, this assault on the federal government, dismantling of it. Part of that is people started having such a problem with the federal government when the federal government started enforcing the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And we're in a time of backlash, but the country has changed a lot. I go down the street and I pass an interracial couple. There's a black man with a white woman on his arm. Nobody's gawking.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody's throwing rocks. That was unimaginable to me. When I was in school and in elementary or high school, the last thing you'd want to be was gay. To be perceived as gay was to be ruthlessly mistreated, beaten up, constantly ridiculed. Nobody was going to come out, for heaven's sake. And I see the Gay Straight Alliance at the high school. It's not been that long. I think, whoa, things have changed. The role of women, when I was young, it was very contested what women's role should be. Women were not supposed to work except poor women. There were people in our church that objected to my mother teaching school because she was the minister's wife. It could be a little controversial just to be a professional. You know, there weren't a lot of women lawyers in the world I grew up. There weren't a lot of women bankers. Heavens knows there weren't women CEOs. And I'm not saying that we have achieved gender equality, by no means. But the world has changed. And some of that toothpaste is going to be very hard to get back in the tube. Imagine anybody trying to tell, you know, Medgar Evers or Amzie Moore or Fannie Lou Hamer, you know, in the late 1950s or early 1960s, that somehow fruitful change for racial equality was on the way. That was a distant star. The whole of American history is the possibility of the impossible. There are a lot of white people who strongly believe in racial equality, whatever their blind spots may be. One point to make about Black Lives Matter is if you go look at the film footage, there are a lot of white kids out there. Again, it doesn't mean we've achieved some kind of equality, but things have changed. There'll always be backlash against that change, but things will change.
Wrestling Darkness is written, recorded, and edited by yours truly, Eric Byler. The music is composed by Michael Brook, while this jazzy improv rendition you are hearing now was performed by David Benene and Stephen Munoz. Wrestling Darkness and other content you will find on the Eric Byler Substack feed are supported by a 501c3 nonprofit called ID Alliance. You can support us by subscribing or by making a tax-deductible donation. Thanks for listening.